For decades, Easter Island has been taught to the entire world as the ultimate cautionary tale, a warning story told in classrooms and best-selling books and countless documentaries. A small Polynesian society, the story goes, settled one of the most remote islands on the planet, became obsessed with building enormous stone statues to honor their ancestors, cut down every single tree on the island to move those statues, triggered a total ecological collapse, descended into warfare and starvation and even cannibalism, and ultimately destroyed almost their entire population through nothing but their own reckless mismanagement. This story even has a name in academic circles: ecocide, self-inflicted ecological suicide. It became one of the most famous morality tales in modern science writing, repeated by historians, environmentalists, and best-selling authors as proof of what happens when a society pushes its environment past the point of no return. There is just one problem. Over the past 2 years, in a remarkable wave of new scientific research using ancient DNA, drone photography, 3D modeling, and careful physics experiments, scientists have systematically taken apart almost every single piece of this famous story. And what they found instead is not a story of suicidal self-destruction at all. It is a story of one of the most resilient, intelligent, and resourceful human societies ever to survive on planet Earth. The old story was not just incomplete, it was, in nearly every major respect, simply wrong. To understand how dramatically this picture has changed, you first need to understand how the original ecocide theory took hold in the first place. Rapa Nui, the name used by its indigenous people, sits roughly 3,700 kilometers off the coast of Chile and nearly 2,000 kilometers from the nearest inhabited Polynesian island, making it one of the most isolated places where human beings have ever permanently settled. Polynesian seafarers first arrived sometime around the 13th century, navigating across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, using nothing but their knowledge of stars, currents, and waves. Over the following centuries, the people who settled there built something extraordinary: nearly 1,000 massive stone statues called Moai, carved primarily from volcanic tuff at a single quarry called Rano Raraku, with the largest standing over 30 feet tall and weighing more than 80 tons. When the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen became the first European to land on the island on an Easter Sunday in 1722, giving the island the name still commonly used today, he found these massive statues already standing, already ancient, with no clear explanation of how a society without metal tools, wheels, or large draft animals had managed to carve, transport, and erect them. The mystery deepened over the following centuries because by the time more detailed records were being kept, the island's population had collapsed dramatically, and almost all of its original forest cover was gone, replaced by grass and low shrubs. In 2005, the geographer and best-selling author Jared Diamond published his hugely influential book Collapse, which presented Rapa Nui as perhaps the starkest example in human history of a society destroying itself through environmental mismanagement, a story that resonated powerfully with modern anxieties about climate change and resource depletion, and which became required reading in classrooms, business schools, and policy discussions around the world. The first major piece of the ecocide story to fall apart was the deforestation itself, the supposed proof that the Rapa Nui people recklessly chopped down every tree on the island to move their statues, triggering agricultural collapse. Research published in the Journal of Archaeological Science by Dr. Terry Hunt of the University of Arizona and Dr. Carl Lipo, then working with Binghamton University, identified a culprit that had been almost completely overlooked for decades: rats, specifically the Polynesian rat, which almost certainly arrived on the island as an accidental stowaway aboard the original settlers' canoes. The island's vast native palm forest, once home to an estimated 15 to 19 million Pascalococos disperta palm trees, produced large, nutrient-dense seeds that happened to be a perfect food source for a rapidly breeding rodent population. Using ecological modeling, Hunt and Lipo demonstrated that a single breeding pair of Polynesian rats could theoretically multiply into a population of more than 11 million individuals within just 42 years under favorable conditions. Excavations at a site called Anakina Beach revealed a textbook pattern of invasive species behavior, an explosive population boom in rat numbers immediately following their arrival, followed by a population crash of roughly 93% once their primary food source, the palm seeds, was devastated. Critically, researchers found supporting evidence from other Pacific islands that were never colonized by these particular rats, where similar native palm populations survived largely intact despite nearby human settlement, strongly suggesting that rodent seed predation, not primarily human deforestation, was the dominant driver of the palm forest's disappearance. The people of Rapa Nui likely did clear some land for agriculture, as virtually every human society in history has done, but the narrative of a population single-mindedly chopping down every tree purely to drag statues across the island turns out to be a dramatic oversimplification of a much more complex ecological story, involving an invasive species nobody had properly accounted for. The second and perhaps most devastating blow to the ecocide narrative came in September 2024 with the publication of a landmark genetic study in the prestigious journal Nature. An international team of researchers, led by Assistant Professor Victor Moreno-Mayor of the University of Copenhagen, along with colleagues from Switzerland, Austria, France, Chile, Australia, and the United States, sequenced the complete genomes of 15 ancient Rapa Nui individuals who had lived on the island between 1670 and 1950, with their remains currently held at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. If the traditional ecocide story were true, this genetic data should show an unmistakable signature: a population bottleneck, a dramatic genetic narrowing corresponding to a catastrophic mass die-off in the 1600s, exactly when the supposed societal collapse was believed to have occurred. The researchers found absolutely no such evidence. Study co-author J. Victor Moreno-Mayor stated plainly that there was definitely not a strong population collapse of the kind that had been argued, the kind where 80 or even 90% of the population supposedly died. Instead, the genomic data revealed a small population that grew steadily and continuously in size, all the way up until the 1860s, when an entirely different and very real catastrophe struck. Slave raiders from Peru arrived and forcibly removed roughly 1/3 of the island's entire population, a documented historical tragedy of human trafficking and violence that had absolutely nothing to do with environmental mismanagement and everything to do with external colonial exploitation. The supposed self-inflicted population crash of the 1600s, the very centerpiece of the ecocide story, simply does not appear anywhere in the genetic record. It did not happen. The same landmark genetic study delivered a second bombshell finding that addressed one of the other long-standing mysteries surrounding Rapa Nui. For years, researchers had observed signs of Native American genetic ancestry within the Rapa Nui population, but a heated debate had persisted over a critical question. Did this genetic mixing happen before European contact in 1722, suggesting the Rapa Nui themselves had made incredible ocean voyages across thousands of kilometers to reach the Americas? Or did it happen only after Europeans began regularly visiting the island and potentially facilitating contact between different populations? The genomic analysis provided a clear answer. Between approximately 6 and 11% of the studied individuals' genomes could be traced directly to coastal South American ancestors, and the researchers were able to calculate, based on patterns of genetic recombination across generations, that this mixing event occurred somewhere between the years 1250 and 1430. This was centuries before Christopher Columbus ever reached the Americas in 1492, and nearly 3 full centuries before any European explorer ever laid eyes on Rapa Nui itself. The Polynesian inhabitants of one of the most isolated islands on Earth had, on their own initiative, using their own navigational skill and their own ocean-going vessels, made contact with the Americas long before Europeans did. A staggering testament to Polynesian seafaring capability that the ecocide narrative, focused entirely on a story of decline and mismanagement, had almost completely overshadowed. The third major pillar of the old story to collapse concerned the population size itself. The ecocide theory generally assumed that the island must have once supported an enormous population, tens of thousands of people, in order to explain how such a small society could have carved and transported nearly 1,000 multi-ton statues, and that this assumed large population was what later crashed catastrophically. A study published in June 2024 in the journal Science Advances, led by researchers including Dylan Davis, Robert DiNapoli, Gina Peccarati, Terry Hunt, and Carl Lipo, took a completely different approach to answering this question. Rather than guessing at population size from statue construction, they used advanced remote sensing and soil analysis technology to precisely map the island's agricultural capacity, specifically a unique farming technique used by the Rapa Nui called rock gardening, in which volcanic rock fragments were strategically scattered across garden plots to improve soil fertility and retain moisture. By accurately measuring the total extent of this rock garden agriculture across the entire island, the researchers calculated the realistic maximum number of people the island's land could have sustainably supported using the technology available at the time. Their conclusion was striking: approximately 3,000 people. This figure aligns closely with the earliest written European accounts of the island's population, which similarly estimated between 3,000 and 4,000 inhabitants. Lead researcher Carl Lipo explained that what the data was actually showing was not evidence of ecological catastrophe at all, but rather evidence of how people survived, despite genuinely limited natural resources, in a fairly sustainable way for an extended period of time. The island never supported some lost civilization of tens of thousands that later crashed. It likely never held many more than a few thousand people throughout its entire history, a population that proved remarkably stable and resilient precisely because the Rapa Nui had carefully adapted their agricultural and social systems to match the harsh ecological limits of one of the most isolated, resource-poor islands on the planet. The fourth pillar to fall concerned the Moai statues themselves, specifically the deeply ingrained assumption that building and transporting hundreds of multi-ton stone giants must have required a powerful, centralized political authority, a singular all-powerful chief commanding a massive coordinated workforce. This assumption had been so deeply embedded in the ecocide narrative that the very existence of the statues was often used as supposed evidence of an oppressive hierarchical society whose leaders prioritized monument building over environmental sustainability. A groundbreaking study published in November 2025 in the journal PLOS1, led by Carl Lipo at Binghamton University alongside Terry Hunt, and several indigenous Rapa Nui researchers, including Gina Pakarati, fundamentally overturned this assumption as well. Using a fleet of drones to capture 11,786 overlapping aerial photographs, the team constructed the first ever complete high-resolution 3D digital model of the entire Rano Raraku quarry, the volcanic crater where nearly all of the island's statues were originally carved. This unprecedented level of detail revealed something nobody had been able to see clearly before: dozens of distinct, separate carving zones scattered throughout the quarry, each showing subtly different extraction techniques and finishing styles. Rather than evidence of one centralized top-down operation, the pattern strongly indicated that production was decentralized, carried out simultaneously by many small, independent family or clan groups working in their own designated areas, sharing some common cultural and technical knowledge, but operating with genuine autonomy. Carl Lipo noted that the sheer physical scale of the statues had always seemed to demand centralized coordination in the minds of earlier researchers. Creating what he described as circular evidence for hierarchy, monuments seemed to imply chiefs simply because chiefs were assumed to be the only entities capable of building monuments. This new evidence directly challenges that old assumption and aligns much more closely with what archaeologists like Catherine Routledge had actually proposed about Rapa Nui's clan-based social structure over a century earlier, describing what researchers now call an open society, one with no single paramount ruler dictating every aspect of life, but which could still, remarkably, produce monumental architecture through the voluntary distributed efforts of many smaller cooperating groups. The fifth and perhaps most delightful piece of the puzzle to fall into place concerned a mystery the Rapa Nui people had actually already explained, one that scientists had simply refused to take seriously for nearly 3 centuries. When Jacob Roggeveen arrived in 1722 and asked the islanders how they had possibly moved their massive statues from the quarry to ceremonial platforms scattered across the island, the Rapa Nui gave him a simple, direct answer: the statues walked. For centuries, this explanation was dismissed by Western researchers as either mythology, mistranslation, or a charmingly poetic but ultimately impractical folk legend, while academics instead proposed and argued over far more complicated theories involving massive logging operations, wooden sledges, and enormous coordinated labor forces dragging the statues horizontally across the landscape. Theories that ironically fed directly into the deforestation half of the ecocide narrative. In October 2025, Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt published definitive new research in the Journal of Archaeological Science that finally vindicated the Rapa Nui's own explanation in stunning, rigorous scientific detail. Conducting a systematic analysis of nearly 1,000 catalogued Moai statues, with particular focus on 62 statues found abandoned along ancient transport roads, the researchers identified specific, deliberate design features built into the statues, notably wide, D-shaped bases, and a carefully engineered forward lean of the center of mass positioned just beyond the front edge of the base. These were not random sculptural choices. They were precision engineering features that created an inherent rocking instability, allowing a statue to be tipped from side to side and walked forward in a controlled zigzag motion, using nothing more than ropes attached at strategic points. To prove the physics actually worked at full scale, the team built a complete 35-ton replica Moai, featuring this exact forward lean design. Using simple ropes and a team of just 18 volunteers, alternately pulling and releasing tension to create a rhythmic rocking motion, they successfully walked the multi-ton statue 100 meters in just 40 minutes. Lipo described the experience vividly, noting that once the statue actually started rocking, it genuinely was not difficult at all, that people were essentially pulling with just one arm each, and that the motion conserved energy and moved remarkably quickly. He emphasized that the only genuinely difficult part of the entire process was getting that initial rocking motion started in the first place. The team further found that the slightly concave shape of the island's ancient transport roads, long visible in the archaeological record but never properly explained, made perfect sense under this new model, since the curved road surface would have helped naturally limit excessive side-to-side rocking and kept the statues moving safely forward along their intended path. The ancient Rapa Nui had been telling researchers the literal simple truth for nearly 300 years. Their statues walked, Scientists had simply been too confident in their own assumptions to listen. So if the Moai were not built by an oppressive central authority recklessly destroying the environment, and if the population never actually crashed catastrophically from self-inflicted ecological ruin, what really happened to the Rapa Nui over the centuries since European contact? The honest answer, and it is a genuinely tragic one, has almost nothing to do with the islanders' own decisions and almost everything to do with what arrived from the outside world. The population did decline significantly, but the timeline and causes look completely different from the old story. The 1860s slave raids by Peruvian traffickers violently removed roughly a third of the population in a single documented historical event. European diseases, against which the previously isolated Rapa Nui population had no immunity, devastated the islanders in the decades following sustained outside contact. A tragically familiar pattern repeated across virtually every isolated indigenous population that encountered European colonization throughout world history. Forced labor practices, land seizures, and the introduction of livestock that further damaged the island's already fragile agricultural systems compounded the damage even further. None of this was ecocide. None of this was self-inflicted suicide through reckless overconsumption of resources. It was, in painfully familiar historical terms, colonization, exploitation, and disease, the exact same combination of forces that devastated indigenous populations across the Americas, the Pacific, and nearly every other region of the world that experienced European colonial contact during this same general historical era. What makes this entire scientific reversal so significant goes well beyond merely correcting one island's specific history. The Easter Island ecocide story had become one of the most widely cited cautionary tales in all of modern environmental writing, repeated constantly as supposedly definitive proof of what inevitably happens when any society pushes its environment past a point of no return through its own poor choices and short-term thinking. That particular morality tale, however emotionally compelling and pedagogically convenient it may have been, now appears to have been built on a fundamentally flawed and incomplete reading of the actual evidence. The true story of Rapa Nui, the one that ancient DNA, drone photography, careful physics experiments, and renewed respect for the islanders' own oral traditions have only recently fully revealed, is in many ways far more impressive than the myth it is replacing. It is the story of a small, sophisticated, technologically resourceful Polynesian society that successfully settled one of the most remote and ecologically challenging islands on the entire planet, carefully adapted their agricultural systems to match genuinely severe natural resource limits, organized monumental engineering projects through cooperative, decentralized community effort rather than oppressive top-down hierarchy, very likely reached the shores of the Americas through their own independent navigational skill centuries before Columbus ever set sail, and managed to sustain a small, stable population for centuries, all without descending into self-destructive societal collapse. They were not the architects of their own downfall. They were remarkably skilled survivors who endured for as long as they possibly could, right up until forces from entirely outside their control, disease, slavery, and colonization, finally arrived from across the ocean and changed absolutely everything. As recently as late 2025, severe drought conditions caused the crater lake at Rano Raraku to dry up significantly, and in the exposed lakebed, researchers discovered yet another previously unknown Moai statue, one that even the local Rapa Nui community's own ancestors apparently had no record or knowledge of. The island, it seems, is still quietly revealing new pieces of its true story, one careful discovery at a time, and each new piece continues pointing in the very same direction. Easter Island was never a cautionary tale about humanity destroying itself. It was always, in fact, a remarkable testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and survival against truly extraordinary odds.